Hey guys, it's Robert Koch here. For those of you that don't remember me, I am the one who studied the Bacillus anthracis bacterium, which causes the anthrax disease. I studied the disease in the 1800s and was able to determine the life cycle of the bacterium, as well as demonstrating what is now known as Koch's postulates. Koch's postulates is used to show diseases can be caused by microbes. Anthrax originated in Egypt and Mesopotamia. It is considered to be the 5th plague out of the 10 talked about in the Bible because it's a primary disease of livestock, which I think is pretty interesting. Thank you, Dr. Koch, for that great introduction. In the late 19th and early 20th century, anthrax was known to be the cause of most uncontrolled deaths of livestock throughout the world. I have been deliberately used as an act of aggression during World War I in the 1900s. There is evidence that show that the German army infected the livestock that was traded with the Allied nations. In 1979, there was also an outbreak of anthrax in Russia that was naturally occurring in the livestock. 64 out of 96 who were infected died as a result from unknowingly eating the infected animals. The most recent outbreak occurred right after the terrorist attack on 9/11. Letters were filled with a white powder containing anthrax spores and were mailed to 2 U.S. senators' offices and news media agencies. The attack of anthrax spore that caused the outbreak was linked to a single spore batch from a doctor located in a specific research lab. Anthrax is most commonly found in agricultural regions of Central and South America, Africa, Asia, Southern and Eastern Europe, and in the Caribbean. Anthrax is more common in developing countries and countries that do not have the veterinary public health programs that can routinely vaccinate animals against the anthrax disease. We are the farmers of the western province of Zambia, which is in Africa. We do not encourage the anthrax disease, but we believe that the anthrax vaccine is not effective and only causes our cattle to die. We do not trust veterinary staff because we believe that they're Satanists. And since there are no veterinary staff close by and available when our animals are dying or are dead, we are unable to determine their cause of death. So what we do is we have to figure it out on our own, usually by cutting open the cattle to view the spleen. That helps us determine if anything is wrong with the animal, if there's any disease that's entered into the animal. If we determine that nothing is wrong, then we'll continue to use the animal for food, even though there is a chance that it can infect ourselves.
An overview of the life cycle starts as the intermediate host in the form of spores, where it lives most of the stages of its life before being consumed by a definitive host, such as a human or an animal. Once inside the host, the bacterium becomes its vegetative form and overtakes the body and is able to sexually mature. They are able to produce toxins that activate the immune system to work against itself, leading to a sudden death of the host. Once the bacterium has successfully killed the host and consumed all remaining nutrients, they are returned back to the ground as spores, waiting for another host. The life cycle of Bacillus anthracis truly is a never-ending cycle. There are many ways you can begin the life cycle, but the most common is to start in the form of a spore. The production of spores are necessary for this pathogen to continue its life cycle, and one of the reasons that it is a dangerous bacteria. These spores are designed to have a tough 3-coated layer of protein that surrounds the DNA, which is protected inside of the core. These coatings are resistant to extreme environmental temperatures such as just below boiling and freezing. They are also able to survive salt, chemical agents, dehydration, and even radiation. It's common for anthrax spores to be found in soil or plant roots in agricultural areas because they can survive these environmental changes. The spores remain dormant from a time span ranging from months to years without nutrients or water until they are disturbed by a host. The most common types of hosts for this bacterium are hooved animals such as cows or sheep and humans. They enter the body through a variety of portals of entry, such as being ingested from abrasion or through inhalation. Once inside of the host, the spores are engulfed by white blood cells that monitor the surfaces of the host's lungs, intestines, or skin for infections such as bacteria, viruses, and germs. These cells engulf the spores through phagocytosis and transport them to the lymph nodes in order for the immune system to analyze. Once the spores reach the lymph nodes, they begin to germinate into the anthrax bacterium. They begin to replicate and multiply, overwhelming the white blood cells that contain them. Throughout this process, the germinating bacterium is also releasing toxins that begin to weaken the wall of the cell until it's able to escape and enter the bloodstream. The toxins that are released along with the bacterium are not the damaging symptom, but it initiates the catastrophic events that follow. The toxin's goal is to attach to receptors on macrophages, whose job is to respond to foreign particles and inflamed tissues when responding to signals of infection from the immune system. By activating the macrophages, these toxins program the cells to produce and release an overabundance of inflammatory hormones. This causes blood vessels to leak, blood pressure to drop, and organs to fail. This process causes the body's immune system to begin to attack itself due to the extent of organs beginning to swell. This also creates the cells to become deprived of oxygen and dying off. Once this process has begun, there is no way to reverse the effects of the toxins. Death soon follows within 24 to 36 hours. Once the host has died, the anthrax bacterium dramatically multiplies, then begins to consume on all the remaining nutrients in the body. It is noted that once all the remaining sources of food are consumed, the host's blood has up to 100,000 microbes per milliliter of their blood. Once the feeding has finished, the microbes are signaled by the lack of nutrients or unfavorable conditions to turn back into spores within the host. As time goes on and the carcass begins to decompose, the billions of spores that were produced are returned back into the ground through the soil, waiting for the cycle to be restarted by the disturbance of a host.
Disease description for Bacillus anthracis. Anthrax was typically known to occur as one of three syndromes: cutaneous, gastrointestinal, or inhalational. A fourth syndrome has begun to emerge with the increasing use of heroin users. First syndrome is cutaneous anthrax. 95% of all anthrax cases are cutaneous anthrax. There is nearly or approximately 2,000 cases worldwide. Most of these occur in Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe. This is because worker and animal vaccination is limited. The mortality rate for cutaneous is, if it's an untreated infection, it's between 5 and 20%. But if you get proper treatment, the mortality rate is much less at 1%. So basically, if you get treated, here's a very good chance that you will survive. Cutaneous anthrax, some signs and symptoms. Of course, cutaneous is on the skin, has to be associated with the skin. So firstly, skin lesions. The initial one is painless. It'll eventually rupture. It forms a black scab. This is the telltale sign of almost all of the anthrax infections. Eventually there will be a black scab. Just to list them off: swollen, inflamed lymph nodes. If the skin on your face or neck is infected, your airway will restrict, become harder to breathe. There'll be other problems associated with it. Fever, itchiness, headache, shivering, chills, soreness. These are all possibilities. Not all of them occur, or most of them may occur, or few occur. As you can see in the picture, you have the obvious edema all over the skin, the big blisters full of fluid, and you can also see the very dark scab forming after the lesion ruptured. The next syndrome is gastrointestinal anthrax. There is two forms of this one. We have oropharyngeal and intestinal. They are both considered the GI anthrax. The mortality rate for this version is between 25 and 60%, so it's fairly high. The rate of associated shock is unknown, but a lot of these cases that do happen are usually associated with shock, and it complicates things further, which raises the mortality rate chances. There's only been one case of reported gastrointestinal anthrax in the United States that I was able to find, so it's fairly uncommon to see this kind of anthrax syndrome develop in people. Some signs and symptoms. Once again, we see the similar to the cutaneous, the groups of small blisters or lesions. They may itch. Fever, neck swelling. The painless ulcer, like I talked about before, it will rupture, causing a black scab. Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. This is because gastrointestinal anthrax is obviously affecting your digestive organs as well, so these things are possible to occur. And as we look at the picture for the gastrointestinal anthrax, you can see on this dissected individual, his intestines are covered with a broad range of those black lesions once again. For the third anthrax syndrome is inhalational anthrax. These are very rare, but sporadic cases do occur throughout the world. Bioterrorism is the largest threat / fear in the world. The accidental discharge happened in Russia, and the mailing case in the United States in 2001. The mortality rates for this form are very high, 94% occurring in natural occurring cases, 86% in the Russian accident, and then 46% in the United States mailing case. The signs and symptoms for inhalational anthrax, you've seen many of these before in the other slides, like the headache, vomiting, feverish chills, body ache, all those. But some differences, you have chest and pain or discomfort, shortness of breath, or coughing. It's because it's going to be entering in through your air passageways. Mediastinitis, this is going to be the inflammation of your mediastinum. And then bacteremia and toxemia, this can occur if this syndrome is left untreated. As you can see in the picture on the left side, this is an individual who does not have mediastinitis. And then the second and third picture, it's a progression picture. It shows the horizontal widening or inflammation of the mediastinum. And for the fourth and most new syndrome is injectional anthrax. This primarily affects heroin users, obviously because they're using needles. Commonly complicated by shock and or meningitis. Some signs and symptoms of this particular syndrome. You get the small cluster, bumps and sores that we've seen before, but it's all around the injection site of the drugs. The painless skin ulcer with the black scab again, obviously. Fever, chills, swelling, edema. And then they can also form abscesses underneath the skin. Thrombocytopenia can occur. This is only in severe or complicated cases. And then necrosis of the superficial tissues of the skin can occur also. This is because of the injection, and then it's infecting underneath the skin. These pictures are the most gruesome of all the pictures in this presentation. On the left, you can see what happens when the heroin user actually left it untreated for a prolonged amount of time. All of the necrosis has been pulled away. And on the right side, you can see that black scab formed right where the injection site actually was, and this is the beginning of the infection. Bacillus anthracis, or anthrax. The virulence factors, there is 3 of them. There's 2 that are toxins. We have a lethal toxin and edema toxin. So basically, these toxins enter the target cell cytoplasm. They disrupt the cell migrations, immune functions. This all leads up to cell lysis, pretty much. This, when the cell actually ruptures, it causes an inflammatory proteins and capillary permeability. And Bacillus anthracis uses this to evade the immune system, colonization, and eventually it's to kill the host. The third virulence factor for Bacillus anthracis is the capsule. The capsules, as we know, prevent phagocytosis by macrophages, helps protect against lysis, and in turn, this of course allows the anthrax bacilli to evade and multiply. And the more it multiplies, the more chance it has to eventually kill the host, which is its final and ultimate goal.
Next, we'll move on to talking about the epidemiology of anthrax. The portals of entry for anthrax include the mouth, the nose, and the skin. In humans, infection acquired by the entry of spores can be through injured skin, which would be through the cutaneous anthrax, rarely through mucous membranes, but it could be caused by gastrointestinal anthrax. And then the most common, which would be the inhalation of spores into the lungs, which would be the inhalation anthrax. Portals of exit for anthrax would include nasal secretions, sputum, blood, pus, urine, and feces. For the mode of transmission for anthrax, there is no evidence that anthrax is transmitted from person to person, but it's possible that anthrax skin lesions may be contagious through direct skin contact. Usually, anthrax bacteria enter the body through a wound in the skin. In humans, it is contracted when spores are inhaled or come in contact with the skin, like mentioned before. You can also become infected by eating contaminated meat from animals that have the anthrax disease. The disease reservoirs for anthrax would include grass-eating animals and the spores, like mentioned before, which can survive in the environment for decades and we wouldn't even notice it. Anthrax normally causes an epidemic, meaning it's a disease for which a longer than expected number of cases occurs in a short time. And it's also normally sporadic, meaning it doesn't occur very often. Anthrax is rare in the United States, but sporadic outbreaks do occur in wild and domestic animals such as cattle or deer. Anthrax is more common in developing countries and countries that do not have veterinary public health programs that routinely vaccinate animals against anthrax. Our last anthrax outbreak in the United States was back in 2001, but in this case, at that time, it was started by a terrorist group who was sending the anthrax vaccine through the mail, but that was the last scare that we had here in the United States. Lastly, we'll move on to talking about the prevention and treatment of anthrax. But before I get into those small details, I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about how our immune system responds to this. Our immune system responds by detecting the presence of anthrax spores by recognizing RNA molecules that coat the spore surface. The spores provoke an unwanted immune response in macrophages. They stimulate the molecule type 1 interferons. As we know, even though interferons are useful for fighting bacteria, they can reduce the immune system's ability to neutralize the bacterium that causes the anthrax disease. Once entered into the human host, the spores germinate and reproduce bacteria rapidly into the bloodstream. Anthrax is almost always fatal in animals, but it can successfully be treated by antibiotics. Treatment with antibiotics is essential, especially for inhalation anthrax. In some situations, preventative antibiotics may also be given to people who are suspected to have been exposed to anthrax spores. Some examples of these antibiotics would include penicillin. Another antibiotic would be ciprofloxacin and also doxycycline. Each of these antibiotics offers the same protection against anthrax. For prevention, the control of anthrax in livestock herds is essential for prevention of its spread to humans. Animals dying from anthrax usually die suddenly, with only a brief illness preceding death. By law, a farmer who suspects anthrax in an animal must notify a government veterinary officer immediately. If anthrax is suspected, the farm will be isolated and herds vaccinated, and the dead animal disposed of appropriately so that contamination of the soil is minimized. Like said before, anthrax vaccines exist for use in livestock, but are not currently registered for use in humans. They have been used for protection of military personnel who are considered to be at risk of exposure for biological weapons, and are also recommended for those that are working with those livestock. Another way to help prevent this is for safety regulations covering rendering plants in factories that are processing wool and hides. These must be adhered to.
and then workers should also wear protective clothing. Even a single case of human anthrax is so unusual that it should be reported urgently to public health authorities. Anthrax spores have been used in bioterrorist attacks in the United States, and it is important that sources of any infections are identified quickly so that the control measures may be put into place.